Hey everyone, welcome to our week 3 of the college football episode of the Dan and Joe Sports Show. As always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.
All right, Joe, we want to start off the show by going into our locks of the week. I had myself an up and down week last week. I ended up coming out pretty much even, but I believe that I worked out on my lock of the week. And this week, Joe, it's like taking candy from a baby on what was offered to us by the gods of Vegas. And Joe, anyone that watched Oregon in the first week just get throttled by Georgia, Bo Nix being the worst version of himself, and Stetson Bennett suddenly looking like a men amongst boys, knows that Oregon's not very good. This is not an Oregon team. It's not the one that had Justin Herbert that pushed Auburn to the border that should have made the college football playoff. This is an Oregon team that probably shouldn't be ranked in the top 25. And meanwhile, they're taking on a BYU team which looked excellent last week, which looked vastly superior to Baylor, who's a great football team in all facets of the game, has a potential Heisman Trophy like level quarterback in Jaron Hall. And Joe, Oregon is favored in this game, and I understand that it's in Eugene, but this is a shocking like line to me because BYU, in my mind, not only wins this game, but probably wins this game by upwards of 10 points. So in my mind, this is easy. Bet the boat, bet the house. You got a Christmas bonus. Throw it down all on the BYU Cougars on the money line to beat Oregon this weekend.
That's definitely an interesting game. Like, I really want to see how BYU plays on the road coming off that emotional win against Baylor. Definitely a game that's on my watch list for sure.
Yeah, Joe. Right now, I definitely have BYU as my dark horse team to maybe make the college football playoff.
I could certainly see it. And speaking of a team, that kind of has playoff aspirations based on how the media hyped or overhyped them in the offseason, NC State taking on Texas Tech is where I'm going with my pick of the week. And I really think that even though NC State's favored by 10 points, I think that Texas Tech's going to cover here. I think this is going to be a one possession game, if not, like a 3-point game one way or another. And I look at the fact that NC State had such a close call against East Carolina to start the season. And then also, to me, Texas Tech is an improving team with their win and upset against Houston. And so I think this is a game that Texas Tech covers in.
Joe, I like this pick. I think Texas Tech played a very excellent game and hard fought win against Houston last week. I think you and I have been on record the entire season saying that NC State is overrated. They showed it in that first week when they should have lost to East Carolina. If the kid from East Carolina could make a field goal or an extra point, NC State's going to slip up at some point. And while they may not slip up in this game, I'm with you. I think that's a solid pick, taking the Red Raiders and the points in this one.
Right.
And Joe, my freebie for those of you out there would be to look at taking Florida State to cover against Louisville. They're only favored by 1.5 points. The Noles are. And I still think Louisville, even though they had an upset over UCF last week, is still a team that's struggling a lot under Scott Satterfield. While I feel like Florida State has a really solid quarterback and they're playing a lot better and they have a lot of confidence off their upset with LSU.
That'll be a very interesting game as well.
Okay. Joe, go into a couple outcomes in the NFL before we get and we preview week 3. There were two games in particular I wanted to talk about. The first off was the beginning win for the Saints in the first game of Dennis Allen's career, where the Saints looked really terrible for 3.5 quarters. And yet they're down by 16 points. And as good friend of the show, Kyle, and all long suffering Falcons fans will tell you, there is no such thing as a safe lead with the Falcons. And yet again, the Falcons proved it. And what was a great win by the Saints, where they were able to come back from 16 points down with less than 10 minutes left and upset the Falcons in Atlanta.
Yeah, the fourth quarter was the type of team I think that I was hopeful they could be this season from an offensive perspective and also defensively. Because when I looked at the roster coming into the year, Dan, it also has something to do with the fact that I think it's somewhat of a down year in the NFC. I think the Saints have one of the better rosters in the NFC, like outside of the Rams, the Bucks, I guess the Vikings now, the Eagles. There just aren't that many teams that are that good in the NFC compared to the AFC. And so I came into the season thinking the Saints had a good chance to be a playoff team and really pressure Tampa Bay this year. And that fourth quarter gave me some hope for that, to be a realization. But they've got to clean up some things. The first three quarters was just horrific. Their offense was not doing anything. I think that one thing that really changed for them was going to the no huddle with Pete Carmichael in the fourth quarter. Their offense just started kind of spreading things out. They were passing pretty much every play. I only remember a couple of runs in the fourth quarter, and Winston ended up being like 13 of 14 in the fourth quarter passing.
Well, Joe, the biggest takeaway that I had from their offense was Michael Thomas suddenly playing football again. I mean, we haven't seen him do anything in 2 years now. He started to be just a drag on the Saints financially. And I mean, you and I questioned many times whether he even wanted to play football anymore, whether he was just trying to do everything he could to get the New Orleans to trade him. And Joe, I mean, my wife actually said this, and I think there's a lot of validity to this. Maybe having Jarvis Landry and Chris Olave and actual good receivers around him motivated him to try, because I think Michael Thomas got bored with how much better he was than everyone else on his team and didn't have any real competitive motivation to go out there because he thought that he always had a spot and he had all this money. But now suddenly we've got two show-stopping wide receivers where if Thomas doesn't play, they could put him on the bench.
No, that's a compelling point. I've seen that happen in other levels, like in high school and college, where you'll see somebody, that's good earlier on, and they'll get to like their junior or senior year, and they won't have as many upperclassmen to challenge them. They kind of lose interest and don't play as well as they did in their earlier years. And I think that really could be the case with Thomas. He's going to be pushed with Olave and Landry. I mean, kind of quietly, the Saints have one of the best wide receiver rooms in the NFL right now. You could argue, it's top two or three with the talent that they possess. And really, encouraged with what I saw out of the offense. But, the glass half empty perspective is they've got to clean some things up, because if they want to be a playoff team, let's face it, Atlanta is somewhat in a rebuilding year with Marcus Mariota kind of as a placeholder quarterback, that they can't be playing a close game like that against the Falcons if they want to compete for the division.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the Falcons are a bad team, and that game was highly upsetting for most of it, especially the defense. I thought the defense played very poorly for most of that game. Now, they did have a really great fourth down stop later in the game that made a big difference. They had a good turnover, I think, inside the 5 where they forced a fumble. So they made some big plays when they needed to, but they were definitely getting scorched. They let Cordarrelle Patterson, who's like you and my age, who's a converted wide receiver into a running back, get the first 100-yard game against the Saints, and I think over 42 games. Mariota, for the most part, had a very good game and tore up the Saints secondary, and probably one of the worst defensive performances I've seen out of the Saints in a while.
No, definitely. And you mentioned Mariota. It was kind of interesting, the subplot of Mariota against Winston, the two first picks, in their playoff history from college. So that was kind of interesting plot line to the story. But it is interesting that Dennis Allen won his coaching debut, because to be able to win a close game like that definitely, showed me something. And it's quite rare historically that you'll see a first-year head coach really win their debut. Like, it seems like a lot of people tend to lose it.
It does. And like I said, the most encouraging thing I took from it is I saw a lot of effort, and I actually saw care out of both Jameis Winston and Michael Thomas, who I feel like in the past have been players that have, whether it's true or not, they've had appearances of being apathetic. Both of them have. And both of them really fought and clawed in that fourth quarter. And Thomas just played excellent in that fourth quarter.
Yeah, he looked like he did, 3 yeyears ago when he was Offensive Player of the Year.
And, on the other side of it, I think Jarvis Landry looked really good. And I just forgot how fast he was, because I never really got to watch him that much. It was with the Dolphins because they were bad. With Cleveland, I felt like OBJ took a lot of it away. But Landry is just such an excellent receiver who just kind of pops up out of nowhere all the time.
No, yeah, it's like I said earlier, it's just amazing the talent they have. You have the NFL Offensive Player of the Year from 3 years ago. You got Landry, who led the NFL in receptions 2 or 3 years ago. And you've got Chris Olave as an electrifying wide receiver. So it's really an embarrassment of riches.
It really is. And I thought Olave had a good first game too, had some grabs. So I'm very encouraged by what I saw there. And I liked what I saw from Jameis Winston in the fourth quarter. And we'll see if we can continue that and do a little better next week.
Yeah, you got to play the Buccaneers next week, so big test there.
That's right. So you gotta improve, and you can't play 3.5 quarters of bad football and one half of good football, or one half of
Mm-hmm.
bad football.
Right.
Joe, you and I, a lot of talk about how great college atmospheres are. I was talking about how that BYU atmosphere at home was just so electric. Obviously, what Texas had against Alabama last week, really excellent when you combine that with the heat, with the angry Texas fans. But sometimes the NFL's got some pretty awesome atmospheres. And the Seahawks atmosphere they had on Monday night when Russell Wilson returned home with the Broncos was one of the loudest games I've ever heard in the NFL. And I mean, it was amazing. And Joe, rarely do I feel like crowds make a difference in NFL games, but this was a different animal altogether. The Seahawks fans made a significant difference in that game. And I mean, what Russell Wilson got inside the 10-yard line like 4 times and got like 0 points. I mean, and then you could hear the loudness. There was a lot of mistakes made, a lot of chances right inside the goal line where the Seahawks faithful would get loud and Russell Wilson would wilt.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we saw that play out so many times in his favor over the years, winning, games, close games at home with that raucous crowd, because a lot of people will say on record that the Superdome in New Orleans and then the stadium in Seattle are the two loudest stadiums in the NFL. And Seattle oftentimes is considered the loudest, and you can definitely see why from what we saw play out. But it was just kind of a weird game to the extent that we saw the Broncos struggle, from time to time to get in the end zone offensively. And then we saw Geno Smith look, the best I've seen him play since his senior year at West Virginia.
Yeah, that was really great for me because I always felt bad for Geno Smith. He was an excellent college quarterback. I mean, he was so good at West Virginia, and then he just got cursed by getting drafted by the Jets. Nobody does good at the Jets. I mean, look at what's going on with Zach Wilson. He was an excellent college quarterback. Being drafted by the Jets as a quarterback right now is a death sentence. I mean, when was the last time that any quarterback did even moderately okay for the Jets? I mean, the best quarterback they've had the last 20 years was Mark Sanchez, who, of course, is of the infamous butt fumble. His most famous play is called the butt fumble, and he's probably the best quarterback that they've had in the last 20 years in terms of wins. So, I mean, I think Geno Smith, that was the beginning of his career, and he was there for 3 or 4 years, and he just got traded around the league because he didn't get off the start that he needed to. And so I always thought that he was someone that had a lot of ability and given the right situation could do well. And I was just so happy to see him have that kind of game and beat Russell Wilson. And I thought the ending, like where he was getting interviewed after the game, his press conference was incredible. He was getting talked to by that sideline reporter, and I think when she asked him something like, well, what do you say? You've been doubted your whole career. He's like, well, I don't have time for those people, and
Yeah.
it was great. I mean, you could just see that just so many years of misery had been lifted off him in that game, and I was just happy for him. I really was.
Yeah, it's ironic too because you see him now in a great situation in Seattle with that crowd. And, ironically, that's one thing that, arguably helped Russell Wilson ascend in his career was ending up, in a great situation in Seattle where he was, as a young player, able to play in a lot of big time playoff games, win a Super Bowl in his second year. And that wouldn't have happened, if he had been drafted by the wrong team, like what happened to Geno Smith. And so a lot of irony there. I know that there was a lot of hype surrounding the Broncos coming into the season, but I've always been concerned for them about the fact that even though they have Russell Wilson and they're improved, I would think, they play in one of the toughest divisions in the NFL with the AFC West. I mean, you got the Chiefs, the Chargers, and the Raiders. Somebody's got to lose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. It's a tough division to be in. And I mean, they certainly had a lot of bright spots on offense. If you look at the yardage, they almost outgained the Seahawks 2-1 in that game. They just
Mm-hmm.
couldn't punch it in. And so I still think there's a chance that maybe they could be a borderline playoff team. But really huge win for the Seahawks, for Geno Smith. And I thought for Pete Carroll, I mean, I can't remember the last time I saw Pete Carroll so excited. He was jumping up and down on the sidelines, looking like he was 15 years younger. And I thought it was so funny seeing him compared to Nick Saban. They're both in the same age range. And Saban looked really old for the first time to me this weekend. I haven't seen many games where he didn't look very sharp. He didn't look very well dressed. Like, he's actually looked his age for the first time ever in that Alabama Texas game. Meanwhile, Pete Carroll looked like he was 15 years younger than he is.
Yeah, I think Pete Carroll's about to turn 70 if he hasn't already. So getting ready to celebrate a birthday. And then also, you look at Seattle. The crazy story to me is with everybody else in their division losing in week one, the first place Seattle Seahawks.
Led by Geno Smith. Great story. And, I really hope that they can make the playoffs. And that'd be really cool to see after everything that happened with Russell Wilson, with him dogging him for so long, them actually make the playoffs.
That'd be quite a story.
All right, Joe, switching back to college football. We have a game this weekend that I'm going to be attending in person, and it's why I'm wearing my Jordan-Hare shirt right now that's orange. There's a lot of rumors, Joe, for the Auburn Penn State game part two, this time being in Auburn at Jordan-Hare Stadium, that Auburn is going to bust out for the first time since the early 1980s orange jerseys. It's going to be an orange out. All the Auburn fans are going to be wearing nothing but orange. And allegedly, we're going to see Auburn orange jerseys.
That would be really quite the theme, and I would really like to see that on TV.
Yeah, and Joe, I'm so interested to see what kind of atmosphere we're going to have in Jordan-Hare Stadium for this, and I really hope they actually do the orange jerseys, because seeing the whiteout was something that was maybe one of the coolest sports experiences I've ever had. I mean, I've waxed poetic about my experience at Penn State last year, how great it was, how excellent the people were and the fans were, and the experience. And I hope that, I've always thought that Auburn is a really, truly unique place to see a game. And it can be one of the loudest stadiums in America. It's one of the best home field advantages. And I want to see if we can get the crowd up and have something like what Penn State had. And I think having the orange shirts and the orange jerseys is going to be kind of a cool experience that's going to, definitely bring that memory back.
I think so. And then also after it being, at Penn State last year, I think, the Auburn crowd is going to be motivated, to show out as well.
Absolutely, Joe. And I think that any of the Auburn fans that went to the Penn State game last year are going to have that incredible home field advantage they had, and the loudness and how much they cared in their mind is going to make them want to be even more rabid and more into this game. And I think Auburn's going to have a significant home field advantage in this one.
I can see that.
And Joe, I mean, that's why I think it's, right now Penn State's ranked number 22, Auburn's unranked, but whoever wins this game honestly is going to be ranked. This is a game to me that really comes down to, I think, who can run the ball better. I know there's going to be a lot made about Sean Clifford. Can he repeat what he did last year when I thought he had an excellent performance against Auburn? What does TJ Finley do? He's had a little bit of struggles his first couple weeks. Is he able to play turnover free? And that's important. But the bottom line is the way Auburn is running the football with Tank Bigsby and Jarquez Hunter, if they can do that the entire game and they rush for over 200 yards, I think they win. And Penn State is last year had a lot of trouble running the football. They did pretty well against Auburn, but really I thought it was Sean Clifford who kind of had the day for them. I think if Penn State can get a decent amount of running yards for them, I don't think they need as much, maybe in the 150 range. They'll probably win. But I think this is going to be a game that it's going to be just which team commits less turnovers and which team is able to run the football better.
Yeah, those are definitely going to be keys. For me, I think that with Clifford, the first 2 weeks of the season, he's completing, I think, close to 60% of his passes, so not quite as accurate as we've grown accustomed to see from him. Going into this tough road environment, I'm looking at two keys that I do think favors Auburn in this game. One is just, the hostility of the crowd and the atmosphere. I think that's going to be tough for the offense for Penn State to communicate on the road. And then second, like you referenced, the running back advantage for Auburn, I think, is definitely a glaring advantage.
Yeah, Joe. I mean, I think this is a significant advantage. I think that Penn State has a transfer from LSU at running back who's good. But right now, I mean, I would put Auburn's running backs up against any team in America right now with the 1-2 punch of Tank Bigsby and Jarquez Hunter. And both of them are playing good. Bigsby's getting more yards right now, but Jarquez Hunter has more touchdowns. And so Hunter's being a little bit of a fantasy vulture right now when you get him in the red zone, doing a good job. I mean, that was really the coming out party, I thought, for Jarquez Hunter last year was against Penn State. He looks like, in a lot of ways, the better running back against Penn State last year. Of course, on that last drive where Auburn almost scored the touchdown to tie it, Jarquez Hunter like hurdled the fully standing Penn State player on an excellent play. And I think he's going to be a big factor in this game. And so, like I said, I look to if the running backs can, have a good, solid production, and TJ Finley has some opportunities on some play actions, I think that's going to be enough to get Auburn to win.
Yeah, I don't think Finley has to do that much for them to win, whereas I feel like Clifford would have to play really, really well, and I just don't see that happening on the road.
And Joe, one thing last year I thought that made a huge difference in that game was I thought Penn State's offensive line played incredible in that game. I very rarely saw Auburn's pass rush get home, but I've noticed in the first couple of weeks already now, albeit it's against lesser competition, I think Auburn's defensive line is actually a lot better than it was last year. And I think some of the people they had last year that were stars, like Derek Hall and Iko Leota, are actually looking much better than they were last year at this time. And I think that Penn State is not going to be able to block Auburn near as well as they did last year. Sean Clifford had all day to throw the ball last year. And of course, he also had a showstopper wide receiver that made a big difference. Doesn't have him anymore. And he's not going to have the ability to sit there for 7-8 seconds to throw the ball. And I think I'm going to look to see Derek Hall get a couple sacks in this game.
Yeah, I could really see that. I could see him kind of being under duress throughout the night.
That's right. And the big deal for Auburn is I think they've got a huge advantage with their front seven. It's going to be a question of whether or not Sean Clifford's able to exploit, which is a little bit of an inexperienced secondary for Auburn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll be a key.
Yeah. But I look at Penn State, and I think they lost a lot on the defensive side last year. They don't have Brisker anymore. Like I said, they lost, their amazing wide receiver they had. And I think that Clifford, while he definitely showed up to be clutch in the Purdue game, also made a lot of mistakes too in what's a road environment that's not going to be anything like what he's going to see at Jordan-Hare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's going to be different, really, than anything he'll probably see even in the Big Ten.
That's right. So I think that, last year I thought the whiteout and the home field advantage spurred Penn State to a win of pretty much even teams in my mind. And I think this year, yet again, we have relatively even teams. I like Auburn's pass rush better. I like Auburn's running backs better. And I really like that crowd. And I think Auburn's home field advantage gets them just over the edge. And I like Auburn to win this game 27-24.
Okay. I'm going to go Auburn 24-16.
Okay. Well, that will be consistent, Joe. They've given up 16 points every game so far this season. That would be funny if there was 3 games in a row where that was yet again where the defense gave up.
I didn't think about that. Quite the irony.
Yeah, so that'd be funny. That'd be very consistent. Joe, moving on to other games of interest that we have for this upcoming weekend. One that I have that I'm just kind of interested to see which team, what is each of these teams. Mississippi State plays LSU, and I thought Mississippi State looked, for those of you who stayed up and watched it, they looked incredible against Arizona. I couldn't believe how dominant they were in that game. And LSU, of course, had that really frustrating loss in week 1 to Florida State. I'm interested to see, does Mississippi State, they've had a little bit of success against LSU lately, I think winning 2 out of the last 3. Do you think Mississippi State gets it done again?
I do, Dan. The more I've thought about it, Will Rogers and this offense is really clicking on all cylinders. It's year 3 in the system for Mike Leach, and we've seen his track record whereas if he's at Texas Tech or at Washington State, when you get to that 3rd or 4th year is when his offenses really take off. And I just think, with a first-year head coaching staff for LSU, a lot of new faces, it's just the exact opposite for State. So a lot of returners on this team, and I think that they will be able to take care of business.
Okay. Joe, one that I was interested in, what do you think about Texas San Antonio and Texas? Texas is coming off this incredibly, emotional ride they had against Alabama. They're down to their second-string quarterback. They didn't win the game. Do you think that UTSA can maybe be another Sun Belt upset pick right here over the Longhorns?
It really wouldn't surprise me. I even looked at that game as maybe, going with UTSA on, the line of the week. I do think Texas probably wins, but that definitely would be a game where I kind of pause and I say, put Texas on upset alert.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that's certainly one where you should look at taking Texas San Antonio on the points. And I would definitely would not be shocked at all if the Roadrunners pulled off the big upset.
Right, for sure.
Um, Joe, looking at where we are right now, of course, Alabama took some steps back last week. Georgia's looks so excellent. What do you anticipate this week when Georgia plays South Carolina? South Carolina didn't look very good against Arkansas. This is a rivalry where sometimes sometimes South Carolina will beat Georgia even when they're not very good. Do you see Georgia as really cementing their place as the number one team this week, or do you think that maybe the Gamecocks give them a little bit more for their money than what do you think they will?
I thought the line was probably about where it needs to be. Like I could see Georgia winning by like 20 something points in this game. Probably a little bit closer with it being at South Carolina and that atmosphere on the road. Also, I'm just interested to see how Rattler in the offense looks for South Carolina. I really looked at South Carolina coming into the season as one of the more intriguing teams in the country, largely because they have a former 5-star quarterback on their team, and I wanted to see how they do in the SEC East. But I think that for me, this game will play out kind of as most people are expecting a comfortable Georgia win.
That's what I think too, Joe. I think Georgia's going to cement their status as the number one overall team, and I don't look for this to be a particularly compelling game.
Okay.
And Joe, outside of that, this is not the best week, I think, for games. I think week 2 was a much more stellar slate than what we have in week 3. One that I find to be kind of interesting are some of these teams that we saw had upsets, like big upsets earlier in the season. How did they do? Georgia Southern plays UAB, where shockingly, after Georgia Southern ended Scott Frost's career, Clay Helton's boys are actually 11-point dogs to UAB, who's coming off a really disappointing loss to Liberty. And I think that could be an interesting game right there to see if Georgia Southern gets it done. And the other one that I have that interests me is Old Dominion after beating Virginia Tech in week 1, also a double-digit underdog to Virginia, who lost to Illinois. Could the Sun Belt have even more upsets this week with Georgia Southern getting the win over UAB and Old Dominion beating Virginia?
That's going to be a good question. Really good chance for the Sun Belt Conference to get some momentum here, with the new additions of some teams this year. They're a conference that feels like they're on the ascent to some degree. So I'll definitely be monitoring those games. Two other games I'm interested in: Wake Forest against Liberty. Want to see how Wake Forest looks. Their offense didn't really look like they missed a beat in Hartman's first start last week. And then also, I mentioned earlier when we were doing our locks of the week, kind of interested in the NC State Texas Tech game.
Yeah, Joe, I'm really fascinated to see how Wake Forest follows up what was a really dominating performance against Vanderbilt. It was sad because we're so used to this with Vanderbilt. They maybe have a couple weeks where they look good and they just completely fall flat on their face. I kind of thought this was a different Vanderbilt team. I didn't think they would beat Wake Forest. You and I both picked Wake Forest to win the game. We thought Vanderbilt would hang, and instead, Wake Forest just killed them from start to finish. And this Wake Forest team looks pretty legit. And I think that, if they really are as good as we think they are, they'll take care of business against Liberty. So I'm interested to see if this is a real team that should be in the top 25 with Wake Forest, or if maybe just Vanderbilt's a little worse than we think and Wake Forest is still getting a lot of hype from last season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'll be certainly something to watch for. And then also with Liberty, while they lost Brewer, I don't know how Freeze continues to do this, but their backup quarterback, or the one who will be starting, who started the last 2 weeks, he's a Tennessee transfer, and I think a former 4-star. And so he's a freshman, redshirt freshman, I believe, but definitely a player to monitor as far as talent.
Well, yeah, he went into Birmingham last week and beat UAB in a game that UAB had circled on their calendars because they lost to Liberty last year. And I definitely thought that was a really surprising outcome for me. And of course, Liberty beat Southern Miss with a backup quarterback too. So that's why definitely a really interesting game right there to see if Wake Forest can win this and not suffer an upset.
Right, right. And then finally, a game that would have had more billing had A&M won last week. A&M Miami will be kind of intriguing.
Yeah, Joe. This is definitely what was going to be the spotlight game of the weekend. Two really great powers going on, really good helmet game. Miami's gotten off to a really hot start under Mario Cristobal. Tyler Van Dyke looks like a top five quarterback in America. Really interesting story with him. He started off having like a couple losses in a row, didn't look good, and then I saw a stat that the last five games of last season, the only quarterback that we've had in the last 20 years that had a similar number of yards and touchdowns in a 5 game stretch was Joe Burrow. So Tyler Van Dyke's got some really good stats, had a good start to the season. They're traveling to Texas A&M, who's going to be a very angry football team after their big loss to Texas A&M. Really good metric game for where Mario Cristobal is in his first season, and one where you and I, frankly, gave Miami no chance to begin the year. Suddenly, this is looking like a very interesting game.
Yeah, Miami suddenly is one of the more fascinating teams in the country, wanting to see what they can do in the ACC this year, what they can do this week against A&M, because they've got Van Dyke, but their backup quarterback, I think his name's Garcia. Their first game of the year, Van Dyke completed like 82% of his passes, and then Garcia came in. He was 100%. He went like 8-8 at the end of the game, and so just a lot of talent, a lot of depth on this roster, and they have great running back play now. They got Henry Parrish, who transferred from Ole Miss, and he's off, to a hot start running. And they've got Kevin Smith, the former UCF great, who's now their running backs coach. And so, really an interesting team, and they've got a lot of momentum heading into A&M.
Joe, here's my dark horse, most important person in this game, and not someone many people would think of. Kevin Steele, Miami's defensive coordinator, and he was an excellent defensive coordinator for Auburn for a long time. Many of the insiders at Auburn wanted him to be Auburn's head coach. He's now Miami's defensive coordinator. He played Texas A&M and Jimbo Fisher a whole lot. Generally, Auburn's defenses did very well against Texas A&M. Texas A&M has had just atrocious offense the first couple weeks of the season. I look for Miami's defense to probably scheme up a pretty good plan, and I think I'm going to go with the Canes on this one.
Yeah, I really think there's a decent chance Miami wins. To your point, great point about defense. Also, I talked about the offensive star power. They've got great receivers. They've got Frank Ladson Jr., a former 5-star who transferred from Clemson. They've also got a Restrepo, who's a great speedster receiver. I mean, this is a very talented team, I think, who's going to be a factor in the ACC.
Yeah, and Restrepo is actually roommates with Tyler Van Dyke. So they have that quarterback receiver roommate connection right there. So that's always something that you see come through a lot of times.
Oh, absolutely.
Like Tebow and Riley Cooper at Florida.
Yep, for sure.
So that should be a fascinating game. And while we don't have the same slate we had from last week, definitely some really interesting bounce back games. Does Texas A&M bounce back from a really awful loss? Does Auburn bounce back from a rough season, not the best first couple games, and avenge a loss to a Penn State team last year who had an incredible environment? And can Auburn match that environment and get a big win? We'll find out this weekend.
Right.
And hopefully next week we'll be talking about a big Auburn victory in their orange out, and a lot of the other games from this weekend, including who ultimately Ole Miss decides on as their starting quarterback. All of this and more next week on the Dan Joe Sports Show. As always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.